As I mentioned before, you can still get good practical results without having a perfect UV layout. Sacrificing some accuracy in your projection for more convenience is something that I do quite often. Um, if you look at these two faces here, the one on the left is what I have in the final game model. And on the one on the right, if you look at the way it's projected, it's actually more accurate. The it's more relaxed. The squares are more square compared to the one I went with. But if you look at the way it's laid out here, I prefer the one I did here. Well, not only because I actually have both sides, but if you just look at the texture, the way it looks here, it looks more like a real face. I feel like I could more easily just glance at this and be able to troubleshoot problem areas more quickly than if I were to go with something like a face like this. The face in general, there's a lot of changes to the surface, and it could get actually a lot worse than this if your character had a big nose or very unique features. It would be very difficult to get one clean shell that was perfectly relaxed. And I just think that the face is a good example of something where you could get away with not having a perfect UV layout, and just being able to do something like this for me, being able to paint like that is it's worth it for me to not have something quite so accurate as this one. The next thing I have on the list is straightening UV borders. Take a look at this, for example. You see that there's a strap, and that is this piece right here. And you can see that I've straightened out the UVs. But realistically, if I had UV mapped this and projected it with, and try to do it with as little distortion as possible, it wouldn't be straight, that's for sure. It'd probably be curving a little bit more. But the reason why a lot of people do things like straightening the UVs out on certain pieces is that not only does it make it easier to pack the UVs inside the space, but it's also a lot easier to texture this way. I mean, if there was a line or a stripe or something like going down the length of the strap, you could literally just paint a straight line here, and it would show up correctly. But you see some people doing straightening UVs also on body parts, like on the limbs. Like you might see, instead of the leg being shaped like this, you might see them laying it out in more of like a rectangle. I don't really do that kind of thing for a higher res normal map kind of characters. It's something that I did do a lot more of back in the diffuse painting days, and it just made things a little bit easier to work with, especially if you weren't painting in 3D. You could, if it was laid out in a rectangle, you could more easily, you paint across on up here, and you know that it would tile to the other side much more predictably that way. But as far as normal maps are concerned, not straining it in this kind of case is more accurate. But things like stretching and straightening UV borders, it's kind of a, at least for me, I deal with it on a case-by-case basis. There are some times when you want as little distortion as possible, especially if you're going to be overlaying some photos, or you need to put some kind of detail that's very consistent, like it relies on very consistent and evenly distributed UVs. But on this particular model, I wanted it to be a little bit more stylized. I wasn't trying to go for a lot of photo noise or anything like that. So having really relaxed and even UVs wasn't that big of a deal for me. Another thing is being able to move your UVs around without worrying about it being perfectly relaxed. On this example here, I have the hair selected, and this is kind of how I laid out most of the hair. But you know, if it was necessary, let me turn on this real quick. If it was necessary, and this part of the UV was kind of in the way and was making it difficult for me to pack this other piece, then I wouldn't hesitate to move it a little bit. You know, depending on the situation, especially on like hair or something, it's not that big of a deal if you just move it a little bit, and even though your relaxed or your projection will be kind of screwed up if you do. It's not that big of a deal usually. I wouldn't be a slave to, you know, how the projection came out. However, there are going to be some times when you may not have so much flexibility with how you're laying out your UVs. Especially if you're using some specific kind of material and it actually requires you to lay your UVs out in a certain way. One of the limitations that can come up is splitting the UVs. Before I was talking about how you might want to avoid doing it for performance reasons, but there are also times when on something like hair, on some shaders that have, for example, anisotropic highlights or something like that, having split up the hair as I have here would have been would have been kind of troublesome for the shader to deal with. Like you'd probably get seams, or the seams would be noticeable on the way the highlight works, because a lot of the shaders that use anisotropic highlights, it needs the UVs to be all welded together as much as you could, and you try to hide the UV seams as well as you can. But you know, if you're not doing that kind of thing, definitely if this piece was really problematic, I would just cut it off and move it to somewhere else, because you know, working in a game environment, sometimes time is pretty important, and if you can save some time by just doing something like that and just trying to, rather than noodling around on your UVs trying to find the ultimate and perfect way to lay things out, then I would go for the quicker way, because especially in a case like that, splitting it off wouldn't have been that big of a deal. I mean, you might run into a little bit of a problem, but in the scheme of things, you know, it's just something that you have to weigh against all the other factors, and the more time you spend on this kind of thing, trying to get it to be perfect, there's definitely a diminishing return on that effort. But anyway, getting back to some of the limitations that can affect how you lay out your UVs. Another thing is the orientation of your UVs. You can see here that I have all these pieces. They're kind of facing different directions. This is obviously rotated, and almost everything I have here that I didn't really worry about how things were oriented. I just kind of rotated them as I saw fit to best fit into the 0 to 1 UV space. However, if you weren't painting in 3D, having some UV shells kind of upside down and stuff, it could be kind of awkward. For example, if you had the face upside down, it could be pretty unintuitive to paint on. But aside from that, there may be some materials that require you to keep things upright. Let's say, for example, you had a material where it had some kind of scrolling effect. Maybe there's some kind of flame that's going up the staff or something like that. In that case, you would need to lay out your UVs pretty straight up and down. And just depending on what the needs are of the UVs, or what kind of special effects that you are anticipating, it could dictate how you have to do some things. But apart from considerations like that, some people like to keep their UVs up, straight up and down, because it's a little bit more forgiving for when you do such things as overlay photo detail, because that way you could feasibly just overlay an image and then have it work on any of the UV shells. But again, that's not something that I was going to do here, so it's not that big of a deal. And you could always rotate whatever you overlay as well, just to match the orientation of things. But depending on the workflow that you're working in, there may be some pipelines where they may not allow you that kind of freedom. So probably not something you need to worry about at the moment, but some good things to keep in mind while you're working.